pick up on that. Now, minor characters, and we want to go over some of the minor characters. There's a really interesting article that you guys have read by a fellow named Joel Williams. Great guy. Taught with him for a little bit. Have a tremendous amount of respect for him. But he wrote basically an article that you guys have read now on the minor characters in the book of Mark. And just a brilliant article and one worthy of consideration. It's up online, free, audio, and full text for you if you want to download it and things like that. And of course, for the class, you have to read it. So, but a great discussion of minor characters. Now, what I want to do is, I want to look at 3 boat scenes in the book of Mark. Mark's got these boat scenes, and I want to kind of just portray these 3 times Jesus is out in the boat with his disciples. You remember, Mark is writing Peter's gospel. We mentioned that, Papias' comment earlier. Mark is writing Peter's gospel. And so I want to look at these three boat scenes, okay? And what you're going to see is in the boat scenes, there's usually a rebuke to the disciples. Jesus is in a boat. There's some crisis happens, okay? He's going to rebuke the disciples, and then there's going to be a miracle. And so in the first storm, you get basically Jesus stills the storm. And basically, they're afraid, and the disciples were rebuked for their fear and for their lack of faith. He said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" Again, this fear notion coming up in the book of Mark. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? So Jesus rebukes them in this first one where he's going to still the storm. Waves are coming in the boat and stuff, and the disciples are terrified. These guys are men of the sea, by the way. James and John were fishermen. So were Peter and Andrew. And so these guys were fishermen, and they know the waters well. That's what they've done their livelihood. And they're terrified because of the winds coming through there. And the winds do get funneled through this pass that comes on the west side of the Sea of Galilee and swoops down on the Sea of Galilee and then up over the Golan Heights. The winds coming off the Mediterranean get kind of funneled, almost like a jet engine. They get funneled into this pass and shoot down, and so you can have these storms come up even till this day in the Sea of Galilee. Now, what's very interesting is, while he rebukes the disciple for their fear and their lack of faith, right in that same context then of this story of chapter 4, where he's rebuking his disciples, in chapter 5 is the story of the Garrison demoniac. And in the story of the Garrison demoniac, guess what they overcome? They overcome the Garrison demoniac. He is healed, and basically these people come from the town, and they too are fearful of Jesus, who healed this guy that nobody can contain. And so you get basically people frightened and ask Jesus, because of their fear, to leave their territory. And so they apparently can't get over their fear. So there's a connection between the stilling of the storm and the Garrison demoniac in terms of this fear. And the Garrison demoniac, the people of the town say, "Jesus, leave." They can't overcome their fear, but the fellow himself apparently does. Jairus' daughter, this is the synagogue leader's daughter. And he comes to Jesus saying, "My daughter's going to die." They come and say, "Your daughter's dead. Don't bother the master anymore. Let Jesus go. Your daughter's dead." And Jesus basically says, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Do you see those same 2 themes coming up? Jairus' daughter. Don't be afraid, just believe. And then Jesus goes, takes Peter, James, and John, mother and father, goes in and raises the girl from the dead. But he says, don't be afraid, only believe. Those same 2 themes then, coming from the stilling of the storm, fear and belief, you can see it kind of echoed through their Garrison demoniac and Jairus' daughter. And then also the hemorrhaging woman, as he's going to Jairus' house, the synagogue ruler's house, with his daughter that had died. This hemorrhaging woman comes up and touches his clothes. And what happens there? He looks at her and commends her for her faith. And basically she's terrified. She comes to Jesus with fear. And she's afraid. And so she touches Jesus and then shrinks back in the crowd. Jesus turns around, "Hey, who touched me? Who touched me?" The disciples say, yeah, right. Who touched you? Everybody's pushing around on you. Jesus, everybody wants to touch you. Okay? And Jesus says, no, something happened. And he sees this woman who's afraid to come to him because basically she's fearful. But she knows she's been healed. So in these 3 stories, what I'm suggesting here is this storm thing happening and Jesus rebuking his disciples for their fear and lack of faith. That fear and lack of faith then is echoed then in the story of the Garrison demoniac, Jairus' daughter, and the hemorrhaging woman, which then comes right after this story. So you've got the first boat story here. And this fear and belief thing being echoed then in these next three stories. Now here's one where Jesus walks on the water, okay? Jesus walks on the water and gets into the boat. And again, basically, and this is in chapter 6, verse 45. Take courage and don't be afraid, for they had not understood the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. They had not understood the loaves. And remember we said that that was one of the things that Jesus rebukes his disciples. Not rebukes, but it's in the text that the disciples did not understand. And so this lack of understanding comes up. Jesus walks on the water. Take courage, don't be afraid, for they did not understand about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. And then right after that, who comes up? But this Canaanite woman, okay? This Canaanite woman comes up. So they basically are not understanding the loaves and stuff. There's an obstacle to their belief, and they had not been able to make the connection between these two things. But yet this Syro-Phoenician woman from Lebanon, basically just north of Israel, she comes to Jesus and she overcomes obstacles. Where the disciples have obstacles there and basically are pushed back, this woman overcomes obstacles, and basically she comes, their daughter's got a demon, and Jesus is impressed by the understanding and revealed her response. And you remember Jesus saying, it's not right to take the food, I'm come to the Jews, it's not right to take the children's food and to give it to dogs. And she, as a Gentile, says, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the food under the table. And Jesus says, whoa, this woman's got faith. And so she's really used as a model here. And it's kind of in contrast, isn't it? You get, again, the suppliant coming to Jesus, and she is commended for her faith. Almost the same time, the disciples, well, where's your faith? The lack of faith of the disciples. And so as we've seen that kind of tension between the suppliants, those who are being healed, and the disciples. And so this comes out with this story here. And then her daughter's healed. She overcomes the obstacle, something the disciples are not apparently able to do. And then the third boat story is the no bread story, okay? Jesus asks them, would you bring bread or whatever? Starts telling them about the yeast of the Pharisees and warning them of the yeast of the Pharisees. This is in chapter 8, verse 18. And so Jesus then, he's telling them, beware of the leaven or the yeast of the Pharisees. And the disciples don't get it. They said, man, why is he talking about yeast of the Pharisees and stuff? He must be hungry. We didn't bring any bread. Oh, no, we didn't bring any bread and stuff. He's probably just hungry, and he's after us because we didn't bring food. By the way, this is Jesus who feeds the 5,000, Jesus who feeds the 4,000. They're worried about food. And Jesus says, guys, and so he says, do you still not see or understand? Again, Jesus rebuking them because they still don't get it. They still don't get it. I mean, he fed 5,000, he fed 4,000, and here they are thinking that he's concerned about food. And he says, don't you see, you still don't see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? And then he says this, do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? Now, anybody that knows the Old Testament, all of a sudden your head's just going, bing, bing, bing. Isaiah, the prophecy of Isaiah. That Isaiah, after his call in Isaiah 6 there, other places, chapter 1, something similar to that, where God says Isaiah is to go out and to prophesy to people who are going to see this stuff but not hear. But they're going to hear these things, but they're not going to hear. Their hearts are hardened. And so all the message that goes out from God, Isaiah is told the same kind of thing. And so that you hear this kind of echo coming out of Isaiah. And so what's interesting in this is, okay, so the disciples, he rebukes them for being basically seeing but not seeing and hearing but not hearing. And guess what happens in the stories? Just prior to chapter 8, verse 18, Jesus healed, guess who? The deaf man, okay? Jesus said, you have ears, but don't hear. Jesus had just healed a deaf man. And do you remember he said, Ephphatha, and basically be opened? And the guy's ears were opened and things. So here you have Jesus healing a guy with his hearing and then rebuking his disciples on this, when they're out and they're asking about the leaven of the Pharisees and things, we didn't bring any bread. He says, you still don't hear. You don't hear what I'm saying. And he had just healed a hearing person. And then right after chapter 8, verse 18, with this boat scene, guess what? Jesus heals a blind man at Posada. Okay? So at Posada, the town just on the north part of the Sea of Galilee there, Jesus heals this blind man. So he heals a guy with his ears, opens his ears, and he opens the eyes so that a blind man can see. And the disciples go on the boat with Jesus, and he rebukes them for not seeing and hearing. And Jesus, on both sides of that, is going to heal someone for hearing and seeing. And so all I'm trying to say is Mark sets up these miracles beautifully. And there's a great kind of irony there. Here's a guy who can't hear, and Jesus opens his ears, but his own disciples' ears are closed. Here's a guy who can't see, and at Posada, and Jesus is going to heal him and give him sight, but his own disciples can't see what he's doing. And so they think he's talking about food instead of that. And so Mark sets up in these three boat scenes, basically he sets them up in beautiful ways. And so Mark focuses on the acts of Jesus, but it's not just the acts of Jesus in terms of just telling Jesus did some special miracle and things. Mark sets up the story to drive these points home about fear, about faith, about seeing, and about hearing. And so it's just, I don't know, it's a really neat aspect of the book of Mark.